Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Hey guys, I'm back again. Slightly different camera angle. Camera's a bit low here. I'm still experimenting with the settings of everything. Hopefully the audio's not too loud or too soft, whatever. It's an experiment in process here still. As I move the camera gets nearer or further away from the speaker, so I have to dick around with the volume levels. Can never quite get the music mix right. So, before the subject became too old, decided to come on and do a video about, I only have a handful of the New Earth records that I spoke about in my preview. I was talking about Sambadi Prem, the guitarist whose CDs I forgot to bring out here. But I was going to show the rest of my collection. I was going to show his stuff too, but I did it in the previous video, and I see now that I left his CDs that I have by him. Oh well, watch the previous video anyway. But this is the one that started it all, Rainbow Bridge. Before I get into that, though, totally unrelated, because he came up several times. Totally unrelated musician. This more in the jazz world, Jay Leonhardt, bassist, who he's come up twice recently. I know it's one of Carm's videos, but it came up somewhere else too. And this is my sole CD that I have by him, Two Lane Highways. And he's a guy that a lot of people aren't going to be aware of, even if you're into jazz, because he fits in a funny area. He's a schooled musician, and most of his career, most of Jay's career, is spent probably in backing anybody in the studio and live. I mean, live he'll play with guys like Frank Sinatra. I know in the studio he's done people like James Taylor. So he's a kind of a for-call musician. I'm sure he's a reader. Plop the music in front of him and he can read it, type of thing. So he gets studio gigs and backs up everybody from there. I know in here was a list somewhere. Roger Daltrey, Duke Ellington, James Taylor, Mel Torme, Frank Sinatra, Diana Ross. So he's backed people like that. It's probably his primary means of earning a living. Now he has done a handful of very fun albums, and I figured I would show my Two Lane Highway album only because he came up recently in discussion. It has nothing to do with the rest of this video. But I don't know. I think, I can recall one Sunday afternoon, I was driving to my sister's house, which is a very unusual time for me to be going there. It used to be that I used to go over to her place on Sunday for breakfast. I don't know why I would be driving there in the afternoon, but I had on the only radio station that I ever listened to, really, in the car. Occasionally college station, university station, but I pretty much leave it on the New York City NPR station, which is called WNYC. They used to have in the afternoons until recently, actually, a program I didn't like very much. Most of their shows are not musically oriented for the most part. They're political and talk shows and that kind of thing. But they used to have a Sunday afternoon, started maybe around noon, jazz program that was mostly not the kind of stuff I like and listen to, mostly vocal-oriented jazz standards from like the 30s and 40s and 50s, a lot of Sinatra. I think they played Sinatra every week, matter of fact. So not really my kind of thing. But they did this one broadcast, as they did only on rare occasion, from an actual New York little jazz club in New York. And for this particular extravaganza, because it's unusual for a jazz club to have, music at, 12 noon or, 1 in the afternoon, whatever it was, they had this guy, Jay Leonhardt, a bassist and singer, and he was playing all his own material. And it was just so fun. I can't describe it any other way. This isn't jazz. This isn't instrumental jazz. It's vocal stuff, which is not stuff I listen to. And no one would probably say he's a great vocalist, because he's not. And I don't think Jay would say he's a great vocalist. What he essentially is on his solo albums, he plays bass, but he writes all of the songs, at least on this one. And mostly he's essentially a storyteller more than a singer. So this album doesn't have any instrumentals, and I don't think he does instrumentals. But when I heard him on the radio, I was captivated by his stories, mostly about his years of experience as a musician, and not necessarily with specific people, backing specific people, but rather the lifestyle of the musician. And, how it lends itself to a kind of abnormal life. And the whole time I was driving the car, I actually slowed down to reach my destination later, so I could hear more of the radio program, because his stories were interesting. And I decided I got to pick up something by him. Didn't really know where to go, so I just chose one. I think maybe one or more of the stories that might have actually heard him that are on this album. I might have heard him do live on the radio broadcast. So this particular album has 11 tracks, no instrumentals, it's all vocals, it's not even a set band. He's got a small group of musicians that he uses, but he's got like 3 different drummers, 2 or 3 different keyboard players, so you don't even know who's playing track to track. 2 different guitarists, 2 excellent guitarists, Joe Beck, the late Joe Beck, and Jay Berliner, who is probably a studio musician, but I remember hearing Jay on Ron Carter albums. And this was done in '96, this particular album. And he's got a flugelhorn player and a trombone player as well, but like I said, a couple keyboard players, 3 different drummers. So it's not, unlike most jazz albums where it's about a set group and the interplay in that group. These are songs. These are all 4 or 5 minute songs. Very little instrumental, unfortunately, because the musicians are all excellent. These are trained. These are jazz musicians. Jay Berliner especially, and Joe Beck on guitars. I would love to hear them do more solos. But Jay Leonhardt is mostly about the stories. And I tell you, it struck me when I put it on again and I just listened to it. This is the album to put on when you're feeling down. There is only one story on here, which you never know whether these are true stories or not, but you get the feeling for the most part that they are, and then others are just kind of like exaggerations starting with the truth. But there's one story about his grandmother passing away, which is a bit of a downer. Very well told, and I'd be gobsmacked if that weren't a true story, just the way that it's told and with the detail in it. But the other 10 songs are all very, very lighthearted things. One of my favorites is called The Playboy Club, where he talks about being a 21-year-old jazz musician that got hired to play in one of the Playboy clubs that used to be out, with the bunnies, with the serving waitresses all dressed as bunnies and all that, and how distracting it was to him. And I'm sure that's true. He probably did, because he got very specific about it. It was 1962 in Chicago, which is where the original Playboy magazine was based out of, and I guess probably where the first club came from. And that part was probably true. That then he gets a bit wacky. The stories about how he really couldn't concentrate on work because of all the Playboy bunnies around, and then he started having dreams about Playboy bunnies and Bugs Bunny, and then he had to go see a doctor, and all those things, which I think are a bit extended from the truth. But he probably did play at the Playboy Club, and it's a hilarious story. Another story called Me and Margarita is about him going to Mexico and getting Montezuma's revenge, that kind of thing. Very, very funny stuff. Very enjoyable. He doesn't, his singing is more of a cross between talking. He's essentially telling a story. There's only the slightest bit of instrumental section. Sometimes between verses, he'll leave some space for a guitar to solo, trombone to solo, trumpet to solo, that kind of thing. And you could, definitely hear the quality of the band. Oddly enough, there's no bass. I thought he would take the opportunity to do a little bass thing in there, or maybe even like do a unaccompanied song with just bass and voice. But he doesn't do that. He's got the full band on all of these tracks. But I'm keeping this one out and available to me simply because it's such a fun. This is the thing to play when you're down. Okay, I just wanted to show that because Jay Lenhart has been on the radar recently. We've been talking about him. Now back to my New Earth collection, and I spoke about. Let me kind of switch to New Earth music, because you were listening to Jay Lenhart's album. My introduction to New Earth, or most of the artists, the lesser-known artists, which are most of them, with the exception of Deuter, who I knew, who records for them. I bought this Rainbow Bridge album. Now, none of the Deuter doesn't appear on here, so none of the artists were known to me when I bought this compilation album. Excellent compilation. It's really nothing more than a sampler album. But it turned me on to all musicians, and I bought, I think it was maybe about 18 of their releases as a result of this, just buying this one album. I forgot to bring out, but I just showed them my previous video, my guitarist, Sambody Prem, who recorded 3 albums for them, which are all really very mellow, excellent, nice acoustic guitar and synthesizer-based albums. Very pretty stuff that I like very much. And despite the name Sambody Prem, he is a German musician, heavily influenced by Rajneesh Osho, who is this religious mystic, whatever you want to call him. I spoke about him in my previous video a bit. It seems like everybody that recorded for the New Earth label, which was actually, I guess, set up and created by followers of this Rajneesh Osho guy, so that all the musicians that initially recorded for them, if not throughout their whole history, were actually followers of his. And also, many of them actually lived in ashrams or temples or the various communes that Osho had throughout the world. And there's a whole series of albums created by the musicians that were apparently recorded in these ashrams and communes during the time that the musicians lived there. But it's interesting that all of the albums that I have on this label were actually not only followers of Rajneesh Osho, but also they're all German musicians who got influenced by Indian music. And when you hear their music, it's not traditional classical Indian music. It's like a more modernized version of it. There's some other influences there, but it's the hand drums and the sitars and the flutes and maybe a little bit of electronic keyboards in the background, barely noticeable. It's not the mainstream, historically accurate ethnic, Indian music. It's not quite the Ravi Shankar thing, though you certainly hear the connection. It's more of a modern version of that. But it's interesting that all the musicians that came on board, not all of them, but so many of them, and certainly all the albums that I have, Sambody Prem, all those folks, were German musicians that got heavily influenced by Indian music And then they were all also followers of this guy, Rajneesh, also known as Osho. And one of the big guys on the label, I recorded a whole bunch of albums. There's another German guy whose name he changed to, I don't know what his initial name was, but known to the music world as Prem Joshua, who's primarily a flute and saxophone player, bamboo flutes, saxophones, santur, harps. He plays a lot of Indian instruments. So he's another German guy, heavily influenced by Indian music, who went on to create kind of this modern version of Indian music. Now, santur, I believe, is a Indian stringed instrument. I should have looked that up. And I also read, I don't see it on here, that he plays... I read that he plays sitar, but I'm not seeing the sitar on here. There's a lot of sitar in his albums, but there's a lot of other musicians that appear in his albums as well. Yeah, he does play sitar, tambura, lots of different types of flutes, saxophones. He's a good musician, and this particular album, Hamzafar, one of the tracks on the Rainbow Bridge compilation was taken from this album, and it's actually a song playing now, to the extent that you can hear it. And I liked it so much that I had to, but by the time I got into this, all these records were pretty much out of print for the most part, so I had to really scuffle around to look for them. And this one I couldn't find anywhere, and I actually had to order directly from the artist himself. So I paid a lot more than if you found it on Discogs or got it through Amazon or something. But when I ordered it, I kept the receipt, which I like to do, and I ordered it back in 2003. May 2003, and back then it was hard to get. So I can imagine most of these for the most part haven't been reissued. They're available as downloads. Really good album. Prem Joshua on sitar and a couple different stringed instruments, Indian stringed instruments, but also mostly, he's a flute and saxophone player. Good. He's got great taste. He's got a real ear for combining instruments, not his own, through overdubbing, and what musicians to pick and use throughout the tracks. Who use hand drummers and any number of guests, even guitar and bass on some track, keyboards on another, vocalists. Sometimes he uses a male and female vocalist on occasion. So there's a lot of guests, hand percussion, that kind of thing. But I haven't heard an album of his yet that I don't like. There's probably a lot of his albums are very similar in direction. So, got that one. Here's another one of his, called Desert Visions. I think this is the first one I got. This one was a little bit easier to get, but again, I'm going back to the early 2000s. So, the availability of these is questionable. Another one in this, very much in the same direction as Hamzafar. I like it very much. Secret of the Wind, another one. Some of these may be more meditative than others. Now, Secrets of the Wind, I have to take a look. I think this one is actually a bit different, because I think it's him just solo. No, I'm wrong. There's a ton of violin. Oh yeah, there's violin players on this one. Lots of guest percussionists, keyboards, bass. He uses a lot on a lot of his solo albums. It seems he uses a lot of additional musicians, mostly keyboards and drummers, like his occasionally vocalists, various types of percussion. This one has violin too, which is not something, and even piano, not something that I necessarily hear on his albums a whole lot. A violin, but it's another great listen. He also formed a band, very confusingly called Terra Incognita. I don't know if you can see the name on there. Terra Incognita, Nita. Bad name for a band because there's at least 3 bands that have records out with that name. And the Terra Incognita group had 2 albums out, apparently, and only 2 with Prem Joshua as a member. And they either called it quits or they decided not to use the name anymore because there are 2 other bands with it. And both of the albums that they recorded, both on the New Earth record label, were sampled on Rainbow Bridge. There's 1 track from each of the albums, and they're really good. And I still haven't been able to get the second one of the 2, but I was able to get one of the 2. I think this is the second of the 2 albums. This is called Tribal Gathering. I then bought another album, I remember by, online, that I thought was their second album. It was a completely different band, a techno band, as a matter of fact. And looking up the history, I discovered that there's at least a 3rd band using the same name, Terra Incognita. Very confusing, which may be why they stopped using it. But Terra Incognita was a band, and the music, honestly, is not real different than Prem Joshua's solo albums. The other 2 members are Chinmaya, who's a sarod player. It's apparently the only instrument he plays. Prem Joshua doing the saxophone, sitar, flutes, tambura, dilruba, and a guy named Ravi, just Ravi, R-A-V-I, who plays guitar, keyboards, percussion, mbira, looks like berimbau, harmonium. He does programming, which would mean, I guess, synthesizers, bass, banjo, bongos, vocals, but I kind of wish they would have stuck to just these 3 musicians. But there's a lot of guests on here, so it's hard to say what the group sound is, because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's like there's 8 guest musicians playing various things. From one guy plays drums, bass, and keyboards, another one plays keyboards, there's a tabla player, a violin player, another percussionist, double bass player, a vocalist, another percussionist. So I kind of wish they would have stuck just to the 3 guys in the group, because it's hard to really say what the group sound is, because you've got this core group of 3 musicians, and then you've got 8 additional musicians, doing things like violins, and I don't know if they ever played live and if they could pull it off because of the overdubbing and all the additional guest musicians, unless they hired a whole bunch of guest musicians to play with them. So it's a little hard to say what the group dynamic was, and I'm still looking for the second album. The other album that I don't have by them, which was their first album, I believe. But it's a good album. It's very similar to Prem Joshua. My guess is that he probably put the group together. And it's if you have the flavor for the Indian music and you like the flutes and the sitar sounds and the hand drum sounds, it's a really good way to go. Now the most well-known probably musician that records for the label is Deuter, and Deuter has I only have a few Deuter albums. Wind and Mountain, which is for the New Earth label, from 2001. Yeah, Deuter, the flute, mostly flutes and synthesizers, and many or most of his albums is just him solo, which is something I really like. He, I believe, is still recording for New Earth. He's probably their biggest name star. Here's an album that is barely credited to him, but is one of those that I mentioned. Recorded for its credit seems to go mostly to Osho, the mystic. There's a picture of Osho there in the back, who's passed away now, but still has many thousands of followers apparently. This is one of those albums, it's marketed as an Osho album, active meditation. Usually there's a theme to the album of some different type of meditation, and the only credit and even in the booklet, is music by Deuter. Well, Deuter wrote the music. There's no listing on who the musicians are. I know Deuter tends to play solo and do multi-tracked overdubbing, but and I read that when he recorded these, he recorded several albums for Osho, apparently while he was living in one of their communes. And there's very little mention of Deuter's name on them, except for this here. The inside booklet has no mention of Deuter whatsoever, oddly enough. It's a good album. It's a little rough. You could tell there's no recording dates or anything, but it sounds like something recorded probably in the early 70s. The recording is a little bit on the rough side, just in terms of not a lot of depth to the recording. It just sounds like something recorded in the early 70s with less than the highest quality, studio equipment, should I say. But it sounds to me like there's other musicians on the album, simply because of the way the hand drumming is kind of aggressive. And in order to record this piece, he would have had to have played the hand drumming first with no musical accompaniment, which, I mean, you can do. I've done it, but it just has more of a live feel to it. It sounds like he's playing along to the hand drumming. But there's no musicians listed. Like I said, there's no recording date. It's a little frustrating to listen to and not know who's playing on it. And I've been bad. I've been trying to follow samples. I've been trying to play samples of the music while I'm talking about it, but I'm behind. You were just listening to Terra Incognita. Now you're listening to the Deuter album. So I don't know. There's several. I thought this was the only album he had recorded for kind of under Osho's name, but Carm has since corrected me, and he's done at least 3 that are basically credited to Rajneesh Osho, which is the mystic leader, with music by Deuter. So right now I'm playing in the background, or however loud it is, I'm not sure, is the track, is the music I'm talking about from this album, where the hand drumming's kind of aggressive, and, you hear guitars being strummed, and it just sounds to me like there's an interplay, like there's other musicians playing here. But there's no information, there's no credit, like I said, not even recording dates, which is very frustrating to somebody like me. Now, I didn't know if I should show albums I have that aren't New Earth recordings, because this is kind of a New Earth thing, but honestly, I don't know to what extent I'm going to cover these artists again, so I thought I'd just throw in the only other Deuter album I have, which is called Cicada, which is not a New Earth album. Prior to recording for New Earth, Deuter recorded for the German Kuck label, which is a great label that I love. This is an album. This is actually the first album I bought by Deuter. I got it on a cassette. I think it was a budget clearance cutout cassette. And I liked it so much that I'm like, I got to go buy the real thing, and bought a real higher quality CD of the music. Really good album by him. I've got a lot, I've probably got 20 of his albums in my wish list, but I only have these 3 so far. And I know Carm said he prefers his earlier Kuck label recordings, but he's done of Deuter's. But Deuter's done a lot of recordings in recent years for New Earth, and they look very interesting to me. And the sound samples I have sound like they could potentially be up there in terms of quality with with the Kuck stuff. But I don't know, because like I said, I don't have many. He's got a lot of albums out. And the other artist I have, I bought a bunch of his albums as a result of hearing him on the Rainbow Bridge compilation, is a guy called Al Gromer Khan. Now, I only have 3 of his New Earth recordings, but I have 4 other recordings by him. Al Gromer Khan, another German guy, like Deuter, who got under the spell of Indian music, and his music is heavily influenced by Indian music. It's perhaps most of the time a little less traditionally and acoustically based than musicians like a Prem Joshua would be, whose music comes very close to sounding like modern classical Indian music. Al Gormer Khan's main instrument is the sitar, but his other main instrument is keyboards, electronic keyboards specifically, which he plays a lot of. In fact, he's got entire albums that he doesn't apparently play any sitar on at all, that he plays just electronic keyboards. He's so he's less he's heavily influenced by the Indian thing, but he's less rooted in making what sounds like a modern kind of traditional Indian music. His albums are generally much more spacious. Not this one in particular, Tantra Drums, because it is percussion based. A lot of very high-tech recorded, what sounds like real hand drums, but I'm thinking a lot of them could be sampled as well. So this one has a bit more flavor of percussiveness to it, and a bit more up-tempo as a result. Because so many of Al Gormer Khan's albums are, I wouldn't call them meditative, but they're very, very laid back, very getting close to meditative. Most of his albums feature, like the next two, which are also on New Earth record label, very similar musical direction. Space Hotel, Future Lounge. These follow what I guess is his primary MO, which is there's sitar in there, but it's backed by a lot of synthesizers, and that's the primary sound, with a little bit of hand drumming here and there, and only lightly percussive. And it seems like at least there's a few albums that seem to follow the path of the more sitar-oriented tracks, and maybe the ones that are a bit more rhythmic, whether they have drums or not, or the ones with drums, kind of start the album. And as the album gets more toward the end, I notice there's more of a tendency to do more of the quieter ambient stuff. More synthesizer-based, less, with maybe no rhythm at all, if any. Which I kind of like that. I kind of like something that kind of starts. If you're going to have a mixture of slightly, I'd say rhythmic tracks, but things with a pulse to them, I like them to be at the beginning of the album, and by the end of the album, you're kind of floating. He's got quite a lot of albums that seem to follow that directive. He's also done a couple, and only a couple albums, that are purely ambient albums. Now, I have 4 other albums. None of these are on the New Earth record label. I thought I'd show them. One of these 2 that I'm aware of, definitely ambient albums, is one called Almond Blossom Day, which is just one track that's almost 55 minutes. I don't recall hearing any sitar on this. It's mostly just synthesizer. And it strikes me as more, and you don't really hear the Indian influence on here as much. What it sounds like to me is, if somebody told me this was Eno, I would believe it. This is probably the only one of his that, at least the full album, I would say, well, it could be an Eno album. Reminds me of Neroli by Eno, Thursday Afternoon, those long form pieces that kind of sit in the same place for the entire duration. This is one of those. Like I said, I don't recall hearing any sitar on this. It's mostly electronic keyboards on here. And then one, here's one to, looking at Al Gormer Khan, another German guy who adopted this Indian name and was influenced by Indian music, and a follower of Rajneesh Osho. He's recorded apparently a lot of albums, like over 50 albums. But here's, and every artist has one of these at least in their catalog. This is on something called Blue Star Communications. This is an album called Konya, or Konya. which is something to avoid. It's boy, this is awful. This is the I think a Tangerine Dream, and if you're aware of Ambient Monkeys, boy, this is one like, what was he thinking? I call these "What was he thinking" albums. Like, why would they put this out? I don't know if this is like put together in a day or something, but there's 4 tracks. It only runs like 37 minutes or something like that, and 2 of the tracks are the same track, Arcania, like a slightly different version of it, and it isn't even a good track to start with. And it's just the way, and the track kind of fades out and you think it's over, and then it comes back with the same musical piece again, and you think it's over, and it fades out. And it does that for like 10 minutes, and there's 2 versions of that on here. And the sounds aren't even good. Like, the synthesizer is very trebly and harsh sounding. The other 2 tracks that make up the album, which make up maybe 20 minutes at the most of material, are a bit better. But I don't know what this is one of those albums, I don't know what he was thinking. It's kind of like, I wonder if this was recorded in a single day kind of thing. There certainly wasn't a concept there. And I'm thinking that the only reason that there's 2 versions, quote unquote versions of the title track, is because the CD is so damn short. They it would have been under 30 minutes if they didn't put the second version on there. Not one to get. One to skip. However, also not on the New Earth label, but very good albums and very similar to the earlier ones I shown. One called Mahogany Nights, which is very good, which is very much like, it could be like the Future Lounge or Space Hotel. Mahogany Nights was another, this is I'd say return to form, because I don't even know what order these were made in, but heavy on sitar and synthesizer, just a little bit of hand drumming in there, and a very good one, which I was attracted to it simply because of the title, called Music from an Eastern Rose Garden, which is one that I really like, from 1989, and this is I think a German label, Aquamarine Verlag. I'm sure I don't have anything else on that label, if that's even a label. So this is even more obscure than the New Earth stuff. This is a really, really good album. Not very different than the Space Hotel and that kind of thing, but just a really, well done. It's good. If I only had one by him, this would be a good representation of what Al Gromer Khan, the synthesist and sitarist, has done. I don't know why these guys changed their names so much, but whatever. Now I have one other. I said I didn't show the guitarist Sambadi Prem that I showed in my last video. I forgot to bring his stuff out. I do have one other on New Earth by a guy named Kamal, another German-born guy, but I think he moved to Australia. Keyboard player. This is a real good synthesizer album. On New Earth, he's recorded several albums for New Earth Records, and even though I only currently have 2 discs by him, I have a third on order. I haven't bought a CD for months because of my lack of funds, but I actually, of all the thousands of albums that I actually have in my wish list, I ended up ordering, simply because I have the credit for it, another Kamal CD of all things. So which will only be the third album I have by him. So I'm going to do I'm going to talk about him a little bit and do a separate video. So I'm not even going to show the other album I have by him currently. This is good. This is Kamal, another German-born guy who I guess fell under the spell of Indian music, but it doesn't really show so much in his music. He's a synthesizer player largely, and does things that would fall under the New Age category, probably. New Age to almost ambient to just electronic music. It's kind of a little bit different than the other artists on the New Earth label. But I'm going to do a whole video on him. And this one ran along, and I didn't think the whole Jay Lenhart thing would take as long to do, but that's what happens. So that's my New Earth stash, plus associated other albums by the artists that record for them. And gone 40 minutes, so it's too much. So sorry about the length. And hope everybody's doing well. I'll be back soon to talk about something or other. And I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.